July 1st, 1989, Las Vegas, Nevada. 14-year-old Stephanie Isaacson woke up, got herself dressed, packed her usual bag, and set off for high school at around 6:30 a.m. On her walk to school that morning, Stephanie took her usual shortcut, which cut through an empty sandlot. She would never make it to school that day. And in a case that would go cold for 32 years before a major breakthrough would finally blow the case wide open, let's delve into the case of Stephanie Isaacson.
People say Ted Bundy didn't show any emotion. I showed emotion.
The following episode is not suitable for those under the age of 13. Viewer discretion and parental guidance is advised.
Stephanie Ann Isaacson was born on Monday the 12th of August 1974 in Nebraska, the United States. From early on, she had a close bond with her father. They would ride horses together, ride motorcycles, go camping, hunting, and boating together. The pair would even go on to get their scuba diving certification together at Lake Mead. The relationship between Stephanie's parents hadn't been destined to last. So when they got divorced, and as a testament to the close relationship she had with her father, Stephanie chose to go and live with her father. This left Stephanie's younger sister, 5-year-old Joanne, to live with their mother, Sharon. The sisters would then spend weekends, Wednesdays, and holidays together as part of the shared custody agreement. Stephanie's father had worked in the US military and was transferred to Las Vegas in 1985 from Lincoln, Nebraska, which was where he had been stationed. Her father described Stephanie as being very outgoing, very happy, and energetic. Stephanie loved singing and had loved being part of the choir. Singing was something that both Stephanie and her younger sister Joanne enjoyed together, and the relationship between Stephanie and her younger sister Joanne had also been close. On one occasion, Stephanie had been with two of her friends, and they'd been talking about going to the mall to go shopping. Stephanie told her friends that she was down to go, but she just needed to go get Joanne ready so that they could set off and go to the mall. Her friends told her that no, they can't take Joanne too, to which Stephanie replied, quote, "If Joanne doesn't go, I don't go." On the 1st of June 1989, Stephanie awoke to the sound of her alarm clock sounding at around 6:30 a.m. You see, Stephanie's father had worked the overnight shift as a staff sergeant at the nearby military base, Nellis Air Force Base, and so she was left to get herself ready for school. She would set off from her house not long after she had woken up, and set out on the short walk from her house to El Dorado High School. She took the very same route that she took every day to get to school.
I was at work and I got a call that Stephanie hadn't gotten home from school. I said, well, she probably stopped off with some friends or they're playing or something. And I said, let me know when she gets home. Well, I got a call about an hour later that they had checked with all of her friends and called the school, and nobody had seen her all day, and the school never called me. I didn't call the police at that time, but as I was walking out, I went by my boss's office and I said, my daughter is missing. I'm going to go look for her. I called my buddy, and him and his wife and another friend of ours showed up, and we discussed what we were going to do. So we got on horseback and started looking.
At school that day, Stephanie's choir teacher had noticed that she had gone missing, as she would usually spend the lunch hour in the choir teacher's classroom with her friends, calling themselves the quote little team. Despite this concern at the lack of Stephanie's presence, the school didn't call her dad. At some point, after setting off on horseback to commence the search for Stephanie, her father contacted the police and reported her as missing. An extensive search effort was then launched to try to find Stephanie.
Metro Police began an exhaustive air and ground search, attempting to locate Stephanie. At approximately 8:40 that evening, near the intersection of Stewart and Nellis, several of her school books and belongings were found in a desert area.
The discovery of Stephanie's belongings led the investigators to establish that it had been highly likely that Stephanie had not been a runaway case. The search efforts escalated, with a helicopter getting involved and canine units being brought in to aid in the search for Stephanie. And it would be an officer from that canine unit that would make a horrific discovery.
Basically, you have a lot of desert area, even in that time in the late 80s in the inner city of Las Vegas. And as you're walking through that desert area, there's a lot of brush. We'll call it tumbleweeds and, weeds that are pretty much waist high. And from walking through there, that's when the officer discovered her body that was laying in the field.
It was really difficult, a lot of crying. I had my ex-wife, the mother of Stephanie, and 4 or 5 friends over. And the first thing I did when we got back in the apartment is I called the radio station and had them play their favorite song, was Wind Beneath My Wings by Bette Midler, I think it was.
This missing persons investigation quickly shifted into that of a homicide investigation. They had located Stephanie's body about 25 yards off the trail that she would normally take when walking to school. Investigators scoured through the death scene and the surrounding area, looking for anything that could help find who had done this.
We investigated the scene and supervised the collection of evidence. There really wasn't any witnesses to anything, so we had nothing like that to go on. So the crime scene was the most important thing to process, and that's what we spent most of the time doing.
The detectives discovered there to have been an orange carpet that had been used to cover Stephanie's body. It was at this point that the homicide investigators and CSI investigators arrived on the scene, and the scene was photographed and documented. The homicide detectives then requested the coroner's investigator to come to the scene. And when the coroner's investigator arrived on the scene, they removed Stephanie's remains and took them to the morgue in preparation for an autopsy to be conducted.
At autopsy, we learned that Stephanie had significant blunt force trauma injuries and that she had been sexually assaulted. The Clark County Coroner's Office ruled her death as a result of strangulation.
Stephanie's hair had been in a state of disarray, with her black shirt pulled up and her denim pants pulled down. Her left breast had been mutilated. No other items of evidence, including her shoes, were found. After Stephanie's remains were released to her family, they were able to arrange for her funeral to take place.
I organized a funeral for all of Stephanie's friends and made sure that her mother knew about it. I only had just one funeral, but I had 2 because I'm originally from Nebraska, Lincoln area. And I actually had Stephanie shipped to Lincoln, and we did another memorial service there and then buried her at Lincoln Memorial Park in Lincoln, Nebraska.
Now, it's important to note that in 1989, DNA technology had been nowhere near as advanced as it is today, and forensic science hadn't the techniques and technologies that you'd use today either. And so the investigators had to rely on speaking to the school, her friends, her neighbors, to try to get as clear as a picture as possible as to who Stephanie had been and what her life was like leading up to the murder, in the hopes that they'd be able to find some kind of clues or evidence or any leads that could lead to the perpetrator. The investigators soon learned that on the morning that Stephanie had been murdered, an unknown vehicle had been parked in the area. Though, when the police spoke with neighbours to Stephanie, they had been unable to relay any further details about this unknown vehicle. Nothing about what kind of car it was, or the license plate, or even what colour the car was. There was nothing besides it being an unknown vehicle, so really a dead-end lead. The investigators reached out to other law enforcement agencies in order to get help in solving this case.
We worked with the FBI, as we often do. So in a lot of cases, when what you have is the behavioral analysis unit with the FBI, they offer assistance, and they have a program that they're able to give you a type of suspect that you're looking for. And in this situation, the FBI did provide assistance, but it was a very generic suspect profile that was given. I would say he's the epitome of evil. Somebody who's able to attack a 14-year-old girl and sexually assault her and strangle her and leave her in a desert is a vile human being to me.
And no new leads came in for the investigators. The clock ticked on, with the case slowly growing cold, albeit still open.
We had a lot of leads, but nothing that was viable. We followed up on every lead that we had, but all those leads brought us to dead ends. And, people had alibis or people were not in the area, but there was nothing that came in Stephanie's case that would lead us to any potential suspects.
In the years that preceded the murder of Stephanie, the investigators claim to have identified several suspects, even going as far as to travel to Washington State, Ohio, and Texas in order to follow up on leads, but all to no avail. By 1998, DNA forensic technologies and techniques had developed far further than what they had in the late 80s, and so the LVMPD's forensic lab attempted to test the evidence collected, samples taken from Stephanie's clothing and from the death scene, to see if they could reveal anything. Though, according to the lab's director, Kim Mergo, the DNA testing in 1998 had been unsuccessful. More years ticked by until 2007, which is when they decided to try again. A cold case team re-examines the evidence using the latest cutting-edge forensic DNA sciences, and they were able to lift a sample of semen from Stephanie's shirt.
We actually had a grant that allowed us to look through a lot of cold cases. That grant that we were working on during that time, Stephanie's case was one of those cases, and we did discover DNA on her shirt during that.
This DNA sample was then run through CODIS, which is the National DNA Database, to see if there had been any matches, or even a partial match, for any known individual in that database, and disappointingly, the results returned no match to anyone in the database. Despite yet another setback, the cold case team refused to give up.
When I took over in the homicide section in 2018, Stephanie's case is one of the cold cases that was being worked, and I brought on a new investigator who came to our cold case section, and Stephanie's case is one of the cases that I assigned to her to specifically work. It's frustrating when you have DNA evidence, but you don't have a suspect. That's the one thing that stands out when you have that type of evidence and you have a case that you haven't solved. When you look at a case from 1989 where a 14-year-old is raped and murdered and there are no real viable leads and it's still unsolved, it's still a very frustrating case as an investigator.
Fortunately, a non-profit organization by the name of the Vegas Justice League shed some new light on the case. The group itself was made up of citizens who are providing funding to help crack cold cases such as Stephanie's.
The Vegas Justice League was created by Justin Wu, and it's this concept that kind of developed on its own of helping out and facilitating cold case solves, where basically like-minded people who want to help the community donate $5,000, which is the exact amount it takes to fund a case, send it to Othram Labs in Houston, Texas, and then Othram Labs reaches out to LVMPD, for example, and they ask for cold cases and they say, hey, we have funding, we can help out, we know that you have a lot of cases, what can we do to lighten the load?
I saw on social media what Othram had been doing with these DNA cases around the United States. And I reached out to them and I said, we would be interested in funding a case, but the one condition would be that we'd want the cases to be in Las Vegas area, because this is where we live.
Suddenly, the investigation got the break it needed due to the donations of the Vegas Justice League for a lab to undergo genetic genealogy. Othram had been that lab that the Vegas Justice League had donated to, and they had been purpose-built to use forensic evidence in order to help identify victims and perpetrators.
We look at evidence that is found at a crime scene, and we analyze the DNA and identify either the perpetrator or the victim that left that DNA at the crime scene. Request is our system in which we communicate with law enforcement, and we're able to track the process from the time the evidence is received all the way to the conclusion of the case. And so they entered the case and we looked at it, and that case is an extremely difficult case. There's very little DNA left. DNA is consumable. Every time you run one of these reactions, you actually destroy that part of the DNA. And so when you're working with such little amounts of DNA as what was left in the Stephanie Isaacson case, you know that you're going to consume most, if not all, the evidence. If your process doesn't lead to the identification of a perpetrator, then you've taken away the last chance that that person has for justice.
The investigators took that leap. Othram scientists used forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a genealogical profile from the remaining DNA evidence, which had only been about 120 picograms, or 0.12 nanograms of DNA, the equivalent of about 15 human cells. This set the record for the new lower limit on the quantity of DNA required to build a genealogical profile for a suspect of a crime. The Othram genealogy team then used the profile to develop investigative leads, which they then returned back to the LVMPD. The detectives finally had their suspect, and they used this DNA profile to confirm the suspect in Stephanie's case to have been a man by the name of Darren Roy Marchand.
I just want to talk a little bit about the suspect in this case, for some background on him. He is, again, Darren Marchand. He was actually arrested prior to Stephanie's murder in 1986 at the age of 20 for the murder of Nanette Vandenberg, who was 24 years of age. Vandenberg had been found strangled in her residence on February 27 of 1986. That case had been dismissed at the preliminary hearing due to lack of evidence. Marchand committed suicide in the Las Vegas area in 1995 prior to his 30th birthday. So unfortunately, there will not be a criminal process in this case. I do have a statement that I would like to read from the mother of Stephanie, and I'm going to quote verbatim. "I'm glad they found who murdered my daughter. I never believed the case would be solved. It's good to have some closure, but there is no justice for Stephanie at all. We will never have complete closure because nothing will ever bring my daughter back to us." This 32-year-old homicide was solved because of the forensic work and genealogy work. Due to the limited amount of DNA that was available, the chances of this case ever being solved without this new technology was very, very slim. The LVMPD would like to thank Othram Laboratory for their hard work on this very difficult case, but the biggest thank you goes to the generous donor, who is Justin Woo, W-O-O, who made all of this possible. Not only Stephanie's family and friends, but our community finally has closure for this horrible crime.
And that's really everything that I have for you in today's video. Thank you so much for watching this episode in my Curious Case True Crime series. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any true crime videos that I post, and hit that bell icon so you can be notified every time I post one too. If you prefer to listen to your true crime in audio form, you can find all of my videos available in podcast format over on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast by searching True Crime with Joshua Miles. If you have a case that you want me to cover on this channel, then go to requestacase.com and send in your case submissions there. And with all that being said, I will see you in the next case.